Thanks for joining us for our first of what we hope will become a series of regular chats with researchers that are on the island of Caribou Key, which is a field station of the Smithsonian. And we'll get more into that in just a few minutes. My name is Laura Diedrich. I'm the Public Program Specialist for the Smithsonian Marine Station. And why don't we real quick, guys, just go through and each of you introduce yourselves. Tell us who you are, what you do, and where you normally are, since you're not normally living on a tiny little island in the middle of the Caribbean.
Sure. I'm Seaver McKeon. I'm a marine ecologist at the Smithsonian Marine Station at Fort Pierce.
I'm Dan Barshus. I'm an assistant professor at Old Dominion University, and I'm normally in Norfolk, Virginia.
I'm TJ Akachanis. I'm a master's student at San Francisco State University and the Romberg Tiburon Center researcher.
Jason Spadaro. I'm a PhD student at Old Dominion University, right next door to Dan.
All right, all very different environments from a tiny little island right on the Mesoamerican Reef. So, why are we here today, guys? I'm going to throw this one over to you, C, because this is sort of, he was the mastermind behind us all getting together today. So tell us a little bit about why the four of you are together and what it is that you're doing on Caribou, just real briefly.
So one of the primary goals of the Smithsonian Institution is to understand and sustain a biodiverse planet. And we chose Caribou as a great model system to start that process. The Smithsonian scientists have been here for about 40 years now. And so we started a program called the Caribou Key Biocode, in which we wanted to get a genetic sequence from every animal on the island. But we also wanted to use that information in exciting new ways. And so look at what diversity means in terms of ecological function or the relationships between individuals within a species. And so all of us here studying on the island this week have different takes on the role of biodiversity in the environment. So we're going to be sharing a little bit of that information with you.
Excellent. And so real quick though, just before we get any further into the specific types of research that each of you are doing and specifically what drew each of you to this working group and out onto the island, C, can you just tell us a little bit more about what is biodiversity? And I think, most people watching probably have a general sense of what that means, but if you could talk a little bit more about what it means to you as a marine ecologist.
So biodiversity is a huge topic. It covers everything from landscape level processes through individual species of animals down to diversity within species or the differences between individuals. So there's a tremendous range within that topic. So to try to encompass that, you really needed to tap into the strengths of different researchers studying different things. For me, I work mostly on the ecological roles of different species in the environment. But that isn't true of my friends here who are all studying different levels of biodiversity. I work mostly on the ecological roles of different species in the environment. But that isn't true of my friends here who are all studying different levels of biodiversity.
All right, and I've just shared a picture of some Uno cards, which is a tool that you like to use to kind of talk a little bit about different aspects of diversity. So do you want to kind of walk us through a little bit? Are you
Sure.
guys able,
you can think of.
able to see the screen there?
We can see it.
All right, excellent.
You can think of Uno as a model of diversity. And so the question is dealt a card in Uno. Say that green 2 in the center of the screen. If that's your card, how do you respond, right? And if you have a hand of cards that is all green, you really only have one response. You can respond only with green cards. However, if you have a multicolor hand, you're more prepared for other events to happen. So the question is, which hand do you want? Do you want an all green hand, or do you want a multicolor hand? They're two different models of diversity. And so we are testing that and what the function of diversity is in a real life environment here at Caribou. So if we had all the same species doing the job of, say, herbivore, would it make a difference? Or do we want different species providing that same herbivorous role? That's the sort of question that we're talking about.
Excellent. And so that kind of leads right into your research specifically. So so what is it that you are hoping to find in your work there on Belize?
So I've been looking at mithracid crabs, which are little herbivorous crabs. Well, some of them are little. Jason will tell you about some of them that are quite large. But they all feed on algae, and they feed on algae in different parts of the reef in different ways. So I'm curious if their role changes from one species to another. And does it matter that we have multiple species, or could we just have one? If there was a conservation, many of those species, if we were to lose diversity, impact beyond the reef. So I'm going to let Jason tell you a little bit more about that line of research with the crabs. But that's the sort of thing that I work on a day-to-day basis.
All right, excellent. And so, yeah, so Jason, why don't you tell us a little bit about what it is that you're working on on Caribou Key?
Okay. I'm interested in how herbivorous crabs, like the mithracids that C was talking about, can help structure and control the benthic algal community on coral reefs. I'm measuring the grazing rates and diet preferences of several species of the crabs, and then we'll use those data to determine what effect diversity and crab diversity has on grazing function.
Excellent. I'm kind of scrolling through some different pictures of some crabs there that you guys have seen and probably, excuse me, do see on the right around the island there. Are these some of the critters that you're working with?
In fact, that big one is, we pulled 9 or 10 of those off of the reef last night for some experiments in the lab.
Wow.
I'll go for you, Laura.
I'm sorry?
He's gonna go get one.
Oh, he's gonna go bring one up.
Oh, all right.
And so this big guy is the one that my dissertation is primarily focused on to this point. It's Damothrax spinosisthmus, the Caribbean king crab.
Right.
It's actually the largest crab in the Atlantic.
And that guy is a grazer.
Yes, yeah.
All right.
Great
Well,
big herbivore.
that actually leads right into one of our first questions from a viewer who is wondering, why does grazing matter? Why is that important?
Well, coral reefs are kind of degrading around the globe, and one of the big problems here in the Caribbean is almost an imbalance in the amount of algae on the reef versus the amount of live coral, where algae can compete with corals both directly for space and using what amounts to chemical warfare. And grazers are kind of defense against that. Well, they're one way to help push that back in favor of coral.
Sure.
So we have different types of crabs. We have parrotfish. We have sea urchins. And so within crabs, we have multiple types as well. And so Jason's working on how some of those different types of crabs might make a difference. That's different from having parrotfishes or urchins on the reef.
Right. And that would be my question is I think that most people, when they think of diversity, they think of it across different types of species. Whoa. they don't necessarily think of the diversity within a group of animals. So how does that big guy that you have there, how does that differ from some of the smaller crabs? And I would assume that they're all important, correct, for the balance of a reef?
Absolutely. So this guy might eat one kind of algae, whereas the others eat different kinds. So if you lose one, you lose that grazing function, or at least redundancy in that function. Excuse me.
So again, it's that question of your Uno card deck. If you have multiple species playing the same role, maybe you have some redundancy. Maybe you have the ability to replicate roles, and it doesn't matter so much if you lose one species. If you have a more diverse Uno hand where everything's a different color, if you lose one card, it makes a big difference to how you respond to a stressor like herbivory or sedimentation. So we're looking at how the different crabs play different roles.
Excellent. And that sort of leads into some of the work that TJ's doing, because it's not just important that a reef have diversity among different types of crabs, but also it's important that there's genetic diversity within a given species of crab as well, right? So tell us a little bit more about how that ties in with what you're doing, TJ.
Yeah, Laura, I'm interested in the importance of genetic diversity in aiding the species in changing climates. And genetic diversity serves as kind of a way for a population to respond to uncertain environments. And a good way to think about it is a group of offspring, say eggs. Low genetic diversity would mean they respond in a very and if an event comes along and all those eggs don't like heat waves, all of them could be wiped out due to the low diversity within that group of eggs. But if you have high genetic diversity, some of the eggs would do very well in a heat wave, or at least survive, and some, probably most, would die. But at least you would have some be able to survive, grow up, and reproduce, and pass that successful stress response on to the next generation. And in my study, coming from San Francisco, I study a group of crabs called porcelain crabs. In San Francisco, these crabs live in the intertidal zone, which is subject to large amounts of stress due to the tide coming in and out constantly, and they've evolved to handle that. But here, there's another species of porcelain crabs, Porcelaina sayana, which are really, really pretty crabs. They live in conjunction with large hermit crabs inside of the shell. And here in the tropics, it's a very stable environment. They're not subject to those large stresses that California are. So I'm going to investigate genetic diversity in the California species and genetic diversity here in the tropic species, and compare them and see if the stability or instability of the environment affects if the genetic diversity is higher in one species or the other due to the difference in stressors.
Excellent. And just to back up briefly, did you say that the porcelain crabs that you study live inside the shells of hermit crabs?
Yeah, it's a kind of a unique relationship. The hermit crabs are about this big. Some of them can get that big, and there's been up to 15 porcelain crabs that are a little bit smaller than a quarter found in the same shell. And here's some that we collected last night that came out of the not gonna really be able to see them, but they're about
right up on the camera.
And what's really interesting about them is their skin texture and coloring is the same coloring as the hermit crab itself. So you can tell they've kind of specifically adapted to live with a certain species and inside of an occupied shell compared to an unoccupied shell. And yeah, it's kind of unknown if they eat the same thing or why that symbiosis exists. So.
And
yeah.
So since you're looking at the genetic diversity in those crabs, have you found, are the crabs that live within, like the population within a given hermit crab, habitat, I guess you could call it, are they closely related, or do you see more diversity in those sort of little micro populations?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I don't think anybody's done that. There's only a few publications about this species, and it's mostly about natural history. But the species in California that I'm studying is what kind of jumped. They're really, really diverse. Like 93% of the broods are of mixed paternity, meaning more than one male fertilized a brood, which increases the genetic diversity, which is kind of an anomaly. So I'm curious to take that data from already published literature in California and actually do the genetic analysis on this species and see what the difference is.
Excellent. And before we get to our last researcher for him to share a little bit about his work, I just want to remind everyone who's viewing that you can send us your questions via the chat box on the right-hand side of your screen if you're watching via Google Plus, and you can also tweet your questions to us by just tagging your questions with hashtag biodiversity chat, and we'll get those and share them here. So now let's move on to Dan. You are coming at this from a bit of a different perspective than everybody else, because you're not a crab guy, you're a coral guy, right?
Yeah, I do like crabs. They are pretty neat and important. And one last note on sort of the herbivory question that'll transition us to corals. Corals are actually animals, and they have a symbiosis with a plant. And so basically corals need sunlight to survive. And when algae grow over, it sort of smothers them and restricts their ability to live. And so that's really the main role and importance of herbivory on coral reefs, is to keep algae from growing over the corals and to kind of keep that algae in check. And that's why we need the herbivores playing that role, the big herbivorous fishes and all these multitude of crabs that these other folks are studying. But my research is kind of a very specific type of diversity, and that's not diversity or between species or diversity in the ecosystem, but really the diversity in the physiology of corals and how they behave in response to temperature in this case. So another big threat to coral reefs is global warming and increased sea surface temperature, and it really affects that relationship between the corals and their algae. And lots of corals are very sensitive. You might have heard of coral bleaching events. And when they lose that relationship, these corals can starve and actually die, which is a big concern. So what I'm looking at is just within a very small area, how is the same species of coral responding to different temperature environments? So say a very small restricted part of the reef that doesn't get a lot of mixing generally heats up a lot more during the daytime, heated by the sun, versus an area with a lot of waves and mixing, cool and more stable. And what we've found in other research in places like American Samoa and the South Pacific is that corals from these hotter environments are actually more tolerant of temperature than corals from the cooler areas.
Oh, interesting. I mean, I guess that makes sense. But I would assume, though, that even in those individual, or in those, in each location, that there's still some diversity as far as tolerance goes. So what are some of the things that you're seeing as far as diversity, just on a very local scale, as far as the tolerance to the different stressors?
Well, I kind of call myself a Darwin optimist, and so basically everywhere we look, we're actually seeing more diversity than we initially thought was on the reef. So in response to these large global stressors like climate change, a very small section of reef, maybe the size of 50 yards long, right out in front of the station here, we used to think that all those corals were behaving very similarly. But when you get a big stress event, a big bleaching event, you often find corals that have bleached right next to the exact same species of coral that has survived and hasn't bleached. And we're just beginning to get a sense of seeing those differences in physiology. You can kind of think of physiology as like a exercise. If you have a coral that's very fit and has sort of gotten used to or exercised its pathways to deal with these types of stress, it might be able to handle them a bit more than your couch potato coral that might not have been exercised or be as used to these types of conditions.
Excellent. So does that mean then that a coral that might show tolerance in one event could show less tolerance in another then, or whether it be the same conditions or maybe slightly different conditions that are stressing it?
Yeah, so we're just beginning to kind of look at some of those questions. There's some researchers who have found that exactly that one coral might be able to survive a first stress, but then the second stress is it's not able to survive, where other ones are better at surviving multiple stresses. And so really, if you can imagine, in terms of climate change, we're going to only see an increase in the frequency and the intensity of these stresses. And so really it's that long-term vision of how these corals will respond to repeat stresses that will be the key to their survival of climate change. But you can imagine that takes a few years to really adequately measure in a way that replicates the environment. So these studies are just getting started, but we're starting to see a lot of really functional diversity at small spatial scales within one species of corals on the reef, which is promising in that when the big stresses are coming, and they're coming more frequently, the corals actually have a lot of tools in their toolkit to be able to survive climate change.
Sure. So you mentioned how some of these studies are just coming online now, and my question would be, what does that look like? So for those of you, the four of you who are there right now, this is your opportunity to do some work in the field before you come back and do sort of your crunching numbers and analyzing data back in the lab. So what is your typical day looking like there on Caribou Key? Let's see, why don't you start?
Well, Caribou is a beautiful place, is the first thing that should be said. And it is right now, just looking off of this porch where we're located, I can see the reef crest from here. It is about 85 degrees. It is bright and sunny. And so I can see seagrass and coral reef from where I'm standing. So we wake up surrounded by biodiversity. Most of our days involve some degree of scuba diving or snorkeling to go find our animals or the plants that we work on. We have a wet lab here where we can test specimens or run small experiments. So there's a number of different facets all available right here in this very small spot. So there's the forereef that is being displayed right now is this sharp drop off. It's a marvelous place to look at how things change in response to depth very suddenly. So in almost the same location, you can get organisms growing at different depths. We're visited by a number of birds, as you just saw. And so there are lots of corals. This is one of the ones that is inhabited by different species of crabs. And so it's a whole world unto itself. And even though the island is very small, we actually have tremendous biodiversity. And so the Caribou Key Biodiversity, or the Biocode, has been trying to get a sense as to that entirety, the entire biodiversity of this very small place off the coast of Belize.
All right. And I'm just
lionfish.
Yeah, I'm just sort of scrolling through some of these pictures here because the diversity is, as you said, it's tremendous.
And it is important. We do work here, so this job, while it's very rewarding and we're in a beautiful place, you know, you can consider a lot of field research to be fairly strenuous in terms of demands and going out early in the morning, being in the water hours and hours during the day to collect these organisms, to find them, bringing them back to the lab. And your job doesn't end when you get back to the lab. We have to keep them alive in the wet lab. We have to set up and run our experiments in a controlled manner. Like for instance, we're until about 9:30 at night because some of these organisms don't operate on our schedule. We have to operate on their schedule. And so it's quite a different way of conducting research, where you're really tying your efforts and your activities directly to the organisms that you're trying to study.
Excellent. And we have another question from one of our online viewers. Bit of an echo there. How do you help each other with your research?
I'm sorry, I'm going to repeat the question. I believe it was, how do we help each other with our research?
Correct.
Yes. Well, for one thing, most of our research is underwater. And so whenever you're in the water, you have to have a buddy, right? So there's some basic safety elements to it. Can you hear us, Laura? I'm not entirely sure.
Yes.
Yes. All right. So there's a safety element, but also in terms of we're each studying different facets of biodiversity. So just having people working on different parts of the same sorts of questions, it makes for a really rich conversational atmosphere. So I can ask Dan about how my crabs might respond in a physiological way to stressors. And so there's a chance for fitting into each other's research in interesting and unpredicted ways. Does anyone else have anything to add?
I mean, we kind of work around each other's schedules. So last night we were all Jason and TJ's workers. So we were helping them find and collect the porcelain crabs and the large Damothrax crabs. The other day, everybody was helping me finding the right coral species. And so we kind of tag team different parts of the day to sort of have someone's research that we're all working to support. And so it's a very collaborative type of atmosphere that a lot of this work you couldn't get done by yourself. And so having a team and really sharing the responsibilities of each of our projects is a neat part of this type of research.
Great, thank you. So one other question. And are you guys still able to hear us? Because it is echoing on our end. All right, excellent. So for any young viewers of this broadcast, if you could, as individuals, share with us your pathway to get to where you are today, what that looks like, what route you took to get there.
I have one. I would say be as good of a student as you can possibly be, and study what you're interested in, and let that guide you. And I think if the ocean, if you really like it, and it's your passion, then if you're a really good student, then all the doors are open to you, kind of thing.
Build relationships with your teachers and get involved outside of just class time.
I think I always tell students it's important to sort of follow your passions. So for me, as an undergraduate student, my first year, I kind of approached my career scientifically. I said, okay, am I interested in science or not? And so the first year I decided, well, science was really the arena for me. And then I started to focus on following things that really made me excited about learning. And so I tried different aspects of chemistry and different sciences and really landed on biology, then I moved into marine biology, then I moved into coral reef biology. So each day, try not being afraid to try something that's interesting to you, and keep following that if it remains interesting, or learn from that experience and pick something else if it's not as interesting. There's nothing wrong with reaching out and something interesting, really keep continuing to pursue it if it stays that way, or changing and moving on to something else if it does.
I would add to that the things that you might not like at your point in your academics. Maybe you don't like math, or maybe you don't like writing. But all of those things that you're learning will become increasingly important no matter what role you choose. So as a scientist, every day I use math. Every day I use writing. Even history comes in. What were fisheries doing in Belize 100 years ago? 100 years ago. These things all connect in ways that you might not see right now, but could potentially be of great value to you. So I would say stick with it. If you do have a passion, stick even with the things that you don't enjoy so much.
And don't let that discourage you from pursuing something that you're interested in. I hear a lot of time, well, I really love biology, I really love marine biology, but I'm not as good at math, or I'm not as good at some aspects of these types of things. Well, the important thing is that you found what you really love to do, and there are so many different ways to study the environment that you can play to your strengths and build upon things that you need to build upon throughout your career. So even though I'm not the best mathematician right now, it doesn't hold me back from actually finding interesting questions that I can answer because I'm excited about them. You can't teach excitement. You can teach other things and work on them over time, but don't let that discourage you from pursuing what you're really interested in.
Yeah, I think that's fantastic advice. One last question. From an outside viewer. What is one of the coolest things you've seen in the field?
We're going to start with Jason.
Here on this trip. How about that?
There's been turtles and squid and big crabs, sharks. I think what the coolest thing that I've seen. Stingrays.
TJ, what about you? Pick one.
Yeah. Well,
The coolest thing I've seen on this trip, I would have to say just the coral, swimming in between the coral and looking at all the different colors and looking at all that stuff. You see everything else that's related to it. So it's hard to focus on one thing when you're 60 feet underwater. So just being there at that point is the coolest thing.
I got two things. So first, this is the first time I've ever seen the elkhorn coral, the Caribbean acropora. So it's on the poster right behind Laura there. Used to dominate the Caribbean, and then in the last decade, 2 decades, it sort of decreased in abundance, and we see a lot of it in Florida. We don't see a lot of it in places, and so that's sort of a personal achievement for me to be able to see this organism in a healthy habitat in a healthy reef. Other sort of less nerdy things that we saw last night, we saw 2 very vibrantly colored squid that were swimming around that did kind of this aggressive pose where they put their tentacles up and almost like a boxer to try and fight us off. And so you really see, especially at nighttime, you really see some things that are very unique that you don't see every day. And that was a pretty neat display, bright colors and very active organisms and in terms of defending themselves and their right to be where they are.
I would agree with Dan. I really enjoy, well, my passion is biodiversity as a whole. And so I really enjoy seeing the shift from the daytime reef to the nighttime reef. So You're swimming in the same place that you were earlier in the day, but everything changes. New species come out, new species are doing different things, there are different predators, there are different colors, there's a whole new cast. So it's that night shift. And the differences between day to night is probably the thing that I've enjoyed the most on this trip.
Yeah, it sounds amazing.
Yeah, it sounds amazing.
So, and just to close up here, we've been chatting for about 30 minutes or so. And we've heard an introduction. I'm sure you've all spent years working on your relative areas of study. So this is going to be probably a pretty tough question. In just a sentence or two. Tell us why your area of research is so important. And we can start with whomever you'd like.
That is a tough question. I guess my research, I feel, is important because we're learning about the ability of these organisms that form the foundation of the reef to survive the stresses with the anthropogenic climate change. So basically, we're learning what we're actually doing to the environment and how big an impact activities have. And I think that's really important to assess whether we really, when and will we change our behavior to avoid severely impacting one of the most biodiverse ecosystems on the planet.
I guess I feel my research is important because of future climate change scenarios. The effect of stress on animals is going to become increasingly more vital to understand, and understanding a species at the genetic level can tell a completely different story than what we can just see with our eyes or experiments.
I think for all of us, the study of biodiversity is really important as we move forward, and unfortunately biodiversity it's important to study what we have now and preserve that natural history as we move forward and new species arrive and old species move out, and I'm really proud to be a part of it.
I would agree. My specialty is the study of biodiversity as a whole. So being able to cross levels, like we've been talking about here, from landscape to within individual organisms, I think that breadth of view that biodiversity as a whole gives us is something really important to hang on to. And so, not just looking at coral reefs, but looking at soft bottom communities, looking at forests, looking up in the Arctic. Biodiversity is the one thing that really surrounds us on this planet. So the role that it plays in our day-to-day lives and the role that it plays in our planet's history are really important ways that the Smithsonian has been adding to the conversations that go on every day. And so it's been a pleasure to be a part of it.
Great. Well, thank you all so much for sharing your time while taking your time out of your busy schedule on the island. I know that you don't have a whole lot of time, relatively speaking, while you're on the island. So thank you so much for taking time to chat with us. For any viewers who are out there and still have some questions, feel free to tweet those to us or post them on Facebook using that hashtag biodiversity chat. The guys are still on the island. We can certainly try and reach out to them and get some of those questions answered via social media. So thank you so much for joining us, and stay tuned for future opportunities to chat with more of our Smithsonian researchers and their collaborators on Caribou Key. So thank you so much. Goodbye, everyone.
Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.